you need to run an errand. It's nothing major. You just have to pick up a prescription, grab a few groceries, drop something off at church, maybe meet a friend for a cup of coffee. Something that should only take 20 or 30 minutes. The kind of thing you've done thousands of times before. And before you leave, you stop. You start thinking, can I really leave him alone? Will she be okay while I'm away? How long am I going to be gone? Should I wait until someone else is here? Should I ask my daughter to stop by? Or should I take him with me? And suddenly, a simple errand requires a long thought-out plan. Not because the errand has changed, but because something else has. Maybe you still leave, but now you're watching the clock the entire time you're gone. Maybe you call to check up on them. Maybe you rush through what you're doing so you can get home. Maybe you decide it's not worth going at all. And before long, you begin noticing something. Your ability to come and go freely has disappeared. Not all at once, little by little, without an announcement, without a doctor's appointment, without a family conference, without some big moment where somebody says, "Congratulations, you're now a caregiver who cannot leave the house." It just started happening. One day you realize, I can't leave them alone anymore, even for a little while. Hey, Christian Care Companion. Welcome back to Dementia Caregiver Support for Christians, the podcast where we help you recognize that your caregiving requires you to make decisions, to respond faithfully with biblical clarity. And if you are wondering whether your situation has changed more than you actually realize, visit our new site, dignicarebydesign.com, to determine whether your situation is reaching a decision point. Here's what many caregivers don't recognize at first. Most caregivers don't recognize it the first time it happens. The first time it feels temporary. You tell yourself, they're only having a bad day. He's a little more confused than usual. I'll only be gone for a little bit. We'll figure it out. And then it happens again and again. And gradually you start making more adjustments. You stop staying out long. You stop making spontaneous plans. You arrange your day differently. You start checking in more often while you're gone. You start to plan ahead. Not because you were told to, but because you're trying to prevent the problems that will occur. Maybe you leave church right after the sermon. Maybe you decline going out with friends. Maybe you stop attending events altogether. Maybe you take a person with you even when it makes everything harder. Maybe you find yourself rushing through every errand because you're worried about what might be happening while you're gone. And over time, something interesting happens. Your life starts getting organized around making sure that they are not alone. Not around your schedule, not around your priorities, but around whether someone is with them, whether that's you, a spouse, a family member, a neighbor, a paid caregiver. It doesn't really matter who the person is. You just know somebody needs to be there, and that is the pattern. It is no longer an occasional concern. It is no longer a one-time incident. It's no longer about a bad day. It's the inability to leave is becoming a part of everyday life. The planning increases. The checking in increases. The worrying increases. The adjustments are increasing. And the freedom to walk out the door keeps getting smaller. That's the pattern. Now here's what matters. because most caregivers think this is a scheduling problem. It's an errand problem. It's maybe a time management problem. They think, if only I were more organized, if only I could find more help, if only I could plan further ahead, then this problem will go away. But that is not what is actually happening. And it's not really about going to the grocery store or attending church or running errands or even leaving the house. These are just the places where you're noticing the change. The real issue is something deeper. For years, your loved one could be left alone because they could manage being alone. They could recognize problems. They could make their own decisions, respond appropriately, keep themselves reasonably safe, maybe not perfectly, but reliably enough. And that was what mattered. Now, let me ask you a question. What has changed? Did the grocery store change? No. Did your schedule change? Probably not. Did the church service change? Definitely not. What changed is the person who is staying home. Something changed in their ability to function independently when no one else is there. Maybe it is their memory, but maybe it's their judgment. Maybe it's their awareness. Maybe they cannot solve a problem. Maybe it's a combination of all of this. The specifics matter actually less than the reality. The reality is that being alone now creates problems that didn't exist before, and that's why you're scrambling. Not because you're overprotective, not because you're worrying too much, not because you're failing to plan. You're scrambling because something that used to work no longer works. Being alone used to be safe enough, and now it's not. And that's a very different problem than simply needing to run an errand. And that's what this is really about. So, what has actually changed? Because that's the question. Not what happened last Tuesday, not what happened when you ran to the store, not what happened when they forgot something. What actually changed? For a long time, your loved one could be left alone because their safety still depended primarily on them. They could recognize a problem. They could recognize that they needed to do something differently, respond appropriately, make decisions, and adjust when something unexpected happened. Again, maybe not perfectly, but reliably enough. Then something started to change. Maybe they left the stove on. Maybe they opened the door to a stranger. Maybe they walked outside once. Maybe they became more confused. Maybe they fell and couldn't figure out what to do. Maybe they were calling you repetitively because they didn't know where you were. The specific event is not the important part. The important part is what this event reveals to you. It reveals that safety is no longer depending primarily on them. That's the shift. And once that shift occurs, everything starts changing around it. The grocery trip, the church services, the doctor's appointments, the lunch with a friend. Not because these activities are dangerous, but because them being alone becomes different. And that is what many caregivers miss. We focus on the event, the wondering, the confusion, the repeated phone calls, the poor decisions. But those are not the things that has actually changed. That is what the change is revealing. That is what the change is revealing. Safety is now depending on someone else. That is why you check the clock. That is why you rush home. That is why you keep rearranging your schedule. That's why you keep leaving the house differently. Because somewhere along the way, safety stopped being carried by them and started being carried by you. And once you recognize that particular shift, something actually becomes clearer. It's no longer primarily a problem of convenience. It is now a problem of who is responsible. And that changes this question entirely. And this is where most caregivers continue to stay stuck, because we try to solve the immediate problem. How do I get through today? How do I run my errands? How do I get to church? How do I go to my doctor's appointments? How do I leave for an hour? These are very real questions, but they're not the deepest question, because once safety depends on someone else, a different decision is hiding underneath. Let me show you what I mean. The immediate decision might be, can I leave her alone today? But the deeper decision underneath that is, who is actually responsible for keeping her safe now? The immediate decision might be, how do I get through this weekend? But the deeper decision is, how will I continue to maintain safety moving forward? The immediate decision might be, can I run this 30-minute errand? But the deeper decision is actually, what happens when they cannot be home alone anymore? Do you see the difference? One set of questions is about today's problem. The other set of questions is about today's reality, because this is the moment when many caregivers begin to see the situation differently. They keep solving today's problem today, tomorrow, next week, next month, and every solution is a temporary Band-Aid, because we're trying to solve a structural change with a short-term adjustment. The reality is that someone you love needs someone with them all the time. And somebody has to make sure that that happens every day, not just today, not just when it's convenient, not only during emergencies, but every day. And once you recognize that, the real decision becomes visible. Can the current caregiving arrangement support that person's safety? Can one person continue to carry it? Do we need more help? Does the schedule need to change? Does the environment need to change? Does the structure of care need to change? These decisions look different in every family, but they all start at the same place. They start by recognizing that your situation has changed. Because until that reality is recognized, caregivers often spend months or even years scrambling to solve the individual problems while missing the larger decision that has been waiting underneath it all the time. Now, let's look at stewardship. One of the biggest temptations for Christian caregivers is to believe that faithfulness means continuing exactly the way we have, trying harder, sacrificing more, carrying more. But faithfulness begins by seeing clearly what is true. In Proverbs 27, verse 12, Solomon writes, "The prudent sees evil and hides himself, but the naive proceed and pay the penalty." Notice what comes first: seeing, recognition, awareness. The prudent person does not create the danger. The prudent person recognizes it and then acts accordingly. That is what we're talking about today. Not fear, not anxiety, not worst case thinking, but actual recognition. If your loved one can no longer safely be left alone, pretending otherwise is not being faithful. Ignoring it is not being faithful. Delaying it is not being faithful. Faithfulness begins by acknowledging the reality that God has placed in your life honestly, because once you see that reality clearly, you can start to make decisions that align with reality, and that is stewardship. And that often is where peace starts. Not because the situation is easier, because when you stop fighting what is true, it becomes clear what you need to do next. So let me leave you with this question. Have you been solving the problem of leaving the house? Or have you started to recognize the deeper reality is that safety now depends on someone else? Because this is not the same thing. Recognizing the difference may be the decision point your family has reached. Now, if this sounds familiar, your caregiving situation might be at a decision point. If you'd like to see whether that is true, dignicarebydesign.com and look at the website, the brand new website, to see whether your caregiving situation is nearing an actual decision. And as I end all of my podcasts, or try to anyway, may the Lord bless you and keep you, and I will see you in our next episode.